It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast from Washington, D.C. Shannon Vavra, national security reporter at The Daily Beast, joins us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show. Welcome back to Pierre Aski, foreign affairs columnist at French flagship public radio station France Inter. How are things?
Hello. Very well, thank you.
With us as well, Tanya Rachmanova, reporter, documentary filmmaker. How's your week gone?
Great.
Great. Wow.
On Friday.
It's Friday, yeah.
It's Friday.
Has it gone great for Rachel Donadio, contributing writer at The Atlantic?
Not bad, thank you.
Not bad. Okay, well, that's good to know. You can, by the way, listen, subscribe, and like The World This Week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other fine streaming services. A day can feel like a year if you're in Ukraine. Thursday came a huge morale boost with the Russians forced to quit Snake Island, that strategic Black Sea outpost where a dramatic standoff unfolded in the opening days of the war. But just hours later, Moscow's missiles hitting an apartment block near the port city of Odessa. The death toll had risen to at least 21 as of a short while ago. The destruction from that seen by Ukrainian authorities, Pierre Aski, as basically payback for Snake Island.
For Snake Island and for the international context, Ukraine just got candidacy approval from the EU. It's got the G7 had new sanctions on Russia. NATO mobilized tens of thousands of men, extra men on the European continent. So there is this need for Russia to show that it's fighting back. And on the ground in Donbass, it seems that, Russia is advancing very, very slowly, very painfully. It has quite heavy losses. So these kind of actions show that they are still leading the war, but in such a despicable way, because these are obvious civilian targets, the same as the shopping mall a couple of days ago. So, it's hard to understand, but I'm not in Russia. We're not in Russia. We don't understand how the Russian government and Putin are handling public opinion. But watching those images from here, you wonder what type of a war this is.
Tanya Rachmanova?
Well, the war, I don't see much difference today from yesterday and from what it will be tomorrow. Speaking about the public opinion, first of all, the Russians don't see anything of this. And the other thing is, and if they try to learn more, I mean, I don't speak about the Russians who left the country, many of them. It's so horrible that they prefer not to think about it. It's too much to take on board. And the government is incapable. I mean, the government is not doing anything. It's Putin with several people around him who decide. So they will go on with the war as they are capable to do it. And for me, it reminds me enormously the war in Chechnya, enormously. The first war.
The first war in Chechnya, where
3 years.
3 years, it was brutal, it was scorched earth, and public opinion often kept in the dark.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, we had Ukraine's president thanking the West after the retaking of Snake Island for that new weaponry that forced the Russians out. Of course, the Kremlin spinning a different tale, calling the withdrawal a goodwill gesture.
This demonstrates to the world community that the Russian Federation is not impeding the UN efforts to organize a humanitarian corridor for the export of agricultural products from the territory of Ukraine. This decision will not allow Kyiv to speculate on the topic of an impending food crisis, citing the inability to export grain due to Russia's total control of the northwestern part of the Black Sea.
So there you have it, Shannon Vavra, even putting the onus on the Ukrainians now, saying demine the waters in the Black Sea. Otherwise, you'll be responsible with all the grain that's not going to the developing world right now.
essentially looking at this entire back and forth about whether this is a goodwill gesture, I mean, give me a break, to be blunt, right? There's other blockades that remain. The war is ongoing. And to borrow a line from the Biden administration, if they wanted to end the war and they wanted to end the blockade, they'd end the war. And insofar as, we're talking about Russia's planning vis-a-vis different battles in Ukraine and whether they're pulling back from Snake Island or not, Ukrainian intelligence has come out and said that their attacks on civilians in recent days may actually have been accidental, at least in Kremenchuk, just given the fact that Russian capabilities for precision strikes like that are not that great. But pulling back from that, I think if you're really asking that question to ask whether Russia's being capricious or not right now and whether they're waging a war, if you're launching missiles and you can't trust their operations and where they're going to strike, it's capricious. If you're planning it deliberately to target civilians, it's also capricious.
And last week, as Pierre Aski said at the outset, it was Ukraine's EU candidacy that was officialized. This week, we heard more of what Vladimir Putin didn't want.
Finland and Sweden will become members of the alliance. We are there to protect all allies, and of course also Finland and Sweden, and we are prepared for all eventualities.
Yes, a summit in Madrid approving a turbocharging of NATO, unseen since the Cold War, with not only the candidacies of Finland and Sweden, but also a 7-fold increase in troop pledges to the alliance's eastern flank. You can see the map there, Rachel Donadio. For those of us who have gray hair, this is back to the Cold War.
Well, speak for yourself. No, it's true. It seems like there is this kind of realignment, and the more troops. The question now is, how does Russia respond to this? And there's been this kind of push and pull for months now, what Russia sees as a provocation. I mean, of course, it invaded Ukraine just out of the blue. It wasn't provoked in that way. But now, how will it respond to that? And then what will this troop presence mean? It really is kind of a return to the Cold War, but without the certainties of the Cold War, with many more uncertainties.
Yeah, it's been said that the leaders today no longer how to speak the language of deterrence that they did back then. There was a code in how the two blocs spoke to each other.
Well, the deterrence still works on nuclear issues, definitely. The Russians and the Americans have their ways of talking and of limiting the damage. But what we're witnessing now is really reassuring the countries that border the war zones more than confronting Russia. These troops are there just to say to Russia, don't put one foot or one boot on NATO territory, because we will not accept it.
But they're more than doubling the size of that territory by bringing in the likes of Finland.
Yes, but that's the paradox of Putin's war, is that Sweden has been neutral for 2 centuries. And suddenly, within a few weeks, it changed completely the course. Finland gave its name to neutrality and to a way of neutrality during the Cold War, and those 2 countries are now going to join NATO and double the size of the common border between NATO countries and Russia. So it's a real paradox. I'm not sure, there's a lot of commentary about the fact that Putin's strategy has backfired. I'm not sure that that's really a problem for Putin, because he is not going to attack Finland or Sweden even if he speaks about the great time of Peter the Great. But still, it's embarrassing diplomatically, and I think that's why we see this burst of escalation on the war front.
Of course, Sweden and Finland are not in quite yet. It still has to be approved by national parliaments. Leveraging its veto power was Turkey, which lifted objections after vague pledges to extradite terrorists. But more importantly, a photo op with the U.S. president, who lifted his objections to selling Ankara F-16 fighter jets.
Particularly thank you for what you did putting together the situation with regard to Finland and Sweden. I mean, you're doing a great job. I just want to thank you.
The tone employed by Joe Biden with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, what's your reaction there, Tanya Rakhmanova?
Well, I think, first of all, the Turks, Erdogan, he is. If anyone who is taking advantage, he will reinforce his position. It will be him from this war. By the way, I don't agree when we say the Putin strategy. I don't think he has any strategy. He has, or at the beginning he had a totally wrong strategy, and now, and I think this is the most scary. If he had a strategy, as it was during the Cold War, there was a strategy, there was kind of confrontation, but kind of, negotiable, reasonable, with each side having their own reasons. What I see now is much more dangerous because there is no strategy.
No strategy on the part of Putin.
No.
Shannon Vavra, your thoughts on this deal that was struck at that NATO summit? Joe Biden's going to have to now convince Congress to sell the Turks F-16 fighter jets.
Exactly. There's definitely still a process that still has to go through over on Capitol Hill. And traditionally, there has been resistance in recent years to providing some of those arms deals with Turkey. Now, as far as the quid pro quo goes, we heard Biden say, this is not a quid pro quo. The U.S. officials have come out and said that as well. But inevitably, if we look at the situation of Turkey basically deciding to allow in Finland and Sweden into NATO, some resistance on Capitol Hill might, I'm not saying it will, but it might sort of degrade a little bit in terms of providing those F-16. So Turkey may be coming out with a win, but I believe just in recent hours, President Erdogan has said, let's not rush to conclusions with Finland and Sweden. We still need to see some of those guarantees that we were promised in that 4-hour meeting in Madrid. So I think we're looking at potentially shaky ground in the coming days here in terms of just how on board with this President Erdogan really is.
Yeah, let's listen to his words. The Turkish president who spoke at a press conference at the conclusion of that NATO summit.
First of all, Finland and Sweden must fulfill their duties, as it is written in the text. If they fulfill their duty, we will submit the memorandum to Parliament. If they don't, it is out of the question for us to send it.
So in that press conference, it was sometimes yes, sometimes maybe, we don't know.
Very vague, and then there's the question of the asylum, not the asylum, but the help me out here, the prisoner, like he wants the Sweden to
extradite Kurdish militants.
And so he's agreed, but then he hasn't agreed. It seems like it's kind of hard to get a straight answer out of him.
Mm-hmm. Those Kurdish militants, how much of this is that a centerpiece of what Erdogan is thinking about? He's running for re-election, by the way, next year.
Erdogan is a transactional president. That means there's no free lunch with him. You don't give. He doesn't give something without receiving something. And there you have the Kurds. You have the F-16. You have so many other things, and you have the crisis within the crisis. In Madrid, he refused to meet with the Greek Prime Minister, because there are a lot of problems, obviously historical, but also current, between Greece and Turkey. And he's not happy because Greece is getting F-35, which is the latest and the most modern version of the US fighter. And he only gets the F-16. So there's so much into this relationship with Erdogan that it is driving everybody nuts.
Driving everybody nuts, and it's going to continue again until it's ratified. It's ratified this approval of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. If NATO leaders can attend summits, well, so can Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, traveling abroad for the first time since invading Ukraine in February, meeting in Turkmenistan with leaders of nations that border the Caspian Sea, and feigning indifference on Finland and Sweden's no longer neutral status.
We don't have problems with Finland and Sweden, such as we unfortunately have with Ukraine. But they should clearly understand that they didn't face any threats before this. If NATO troops and infrastructure are deployed, we will be compelled to respond in kind.
Tanya Rachmanova, how should the Finns and the Swedes interpret what you just heard there?
Well, I think that they should join NATO as soon as possible. All I can say. No, well, look, what he's saying, he has to say. It's all wooden language that, he learned in the Soviet Union, this responding like as a mirror. How could he respond? I mean, what does it mean? It's just he. And also, you should forget that he is speaking to his Russian audience. So Russian audience, he has to answer this. Will he do something? What is he capable of doing? What he could do? Nothing much.
He
has to say.
He can't do much, but Russia does have outsized influence throughout the world. We've seen it not just militarily, but also in the way it projects itself to the developing world. It doesn't see Russia the way that here in Europe we see it, and in the United States as well. Russian disinformation campaigns, which, by the way, flopped miserably the day Vladimir Putin's troops invaded Ukraine unprovoked. But the Kremlin can play the long game and hone its narrative for the fall, when gas supplies potentially run low here in Europe and pro-Trump candidates run in midterm elections. Shannon Vavra, you spoke to a former CIA Moscow chief of station who predicted Vladimir Putin's going to try really hard to exacerbate isolationist tendencies in the U.S. and kind of induce us to question, why are we supporting Ukraine? The wheels are in motion?
Exactly. And that's the kind of thing where when we look at Russian information operations, it's kind of like breathing air or breathing water. They're always going on. But I spoke to this former CIA Moscow station chief who said, obviously Putin is watching politics in America because he's probably willing to bet that he can outlast Biden. He can outlast potential sympathies for Ukraine. And in looking into that sort of thought and commentary, I came across 2 U.S. intelligence memos, one of which already shows that Russian information operations targeting the West and English speakers has a focus already on trying to dissuade sort of aid to Ukraine. It tries to paint Western aid as prolonging the war, not to mention what caused the war in the first place and causing the food crisis. So we already see this narrative trying to sort of break out from Russia in English circles about whether or not it's prudent to be supporting the war in Ukraine, trying to paint it as somewhat of a dangerous provocation. And the second U.S. intelligence memo that I came across says that the U.S. currently assesses that Russia will probably be trying to interfere in U.S. midterm elections, whether that's trying to dissuade voters from going to the proper voting locations or providing misinformation about polling. Americans should probably be on the lookout for bad information circulating online that might be foreign interference in our elections.
Rachel Donadio, we had those same kind of warnings before the recent French elections. A lot has changed since 2016. What's your feeling when you hear these kinds of warnings?
Well, I think that we know that there will be Russian interference of some kind, and then the question is just, how do people act on that? Are people aware of it? Do we know what it is? I mean, it has to be kind of concrete. It's like ambient noise, I think, right now. I mean, is it on social media? Is it about how people get their information? Is it? I mean, before the 2017 election, there was a much more, I think, active sense of a kind of a hack and everything. But that I don't know if voters think about this really. I mean, I don't know how. I think we just really need to see how that plays out in a kind of a concrete way.
Have we gotten any better, Piaski? Now there's all these fact-checking websites and the likes, and intelligence services are on the lookout.
Well, look, we were taken by surprise in 2015, 2016, the Brexit referendum and the U.S. elections, and I think today these tactics are far less effective, and but maybe because the damage has been done and the polarization of our societies is there, whether it's in US or here in France. We have a polarization, we have a discredit on mainstream media, we have a situation where, in a way, Russia has less to do than in the past to interfere, because the grains of divisions have been already put in place.
Shannon Vavra, you agree?
I do, yes, and I think that's such a good point, because if Russia wanted to, say, exacerbate particular issues that are just domestically focused, take your pick from the last 2 weeks, at least in the U.S., guns,
We'll get to
abortion, EPA regulations.
No, go on. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was just going to say, one of Russia's typical tactics in its disinformation and influence operations is to cherry-pick domestic information that they can sort of inflame on either side. And sometimes I think we get lost in the idea that maybe in the past, the Senate Intelligence Committee came out and said, yes, Putin had developed a preference for Trump's campaign, and there were various other intelligence documents that said that Putin was trying to denigrate Biden's campaign and sort of support Trump's. But on a lower level, it's not necessarily about picking sides. It's just about inflaming tensions. And as one of my colleagues earlier mentioned, that's very possible right now. And we almost don't need that interference. We already have such high tensions.
And we'll get to those tensions in a moment. First, though, Vladimir Putin traveling abroad for the first time since February for that summit we talked about. China's president leaving the mainland for the first time since the start of the COVID pandemic in early 2020. Xi Jinping and First Lady Peng Liyuan in Hong Kong for the 25th anniversary of the handover by Britain of that former UK colony. Pro-democracy activists see the visit, coupled with the swearing in of Beijing's new hand-picked chief executive, as another nail in the coffin of Hong Kong's autonomy. Xi thinks otherwise.
After reuniting with the motherland, the Hong Kong people became the masters of their own city and realized Hong Kong people should manage Hong Kong. Hong Kong's true democracy started here.
What does he mean, Piaski?
He means that, China has gone expert in using words and providing them with a different meaning. So when Xi Jinping says, now is the time for true democracy, just understand that democracy is over. And that's what he means. This visit to Hong Kong is like a victory lap, for Xi Jinping. I'm very sad to see those images, to be honest, because I've seen Hong Kong as a vibrant society. I was a correspondent in Beijing, and I visited very often Hong Kong. It had an incredible civil society. It had a free press. It had people who were able to demonstrate or to express their views without fear or retribution. That's over. Hong Kong is now part and parcel of the Chinese system, when China had promised 50 years of autonomy. One country, two system was the nickname of this situation, and it hasn't even lasted half of that time. Not only 25 years of those 50 years have passed since the handover in 1997, and today the normalization, as to use a word of the Soviet times, is in process and highly advanced. So this visit is just a confirmation of this.
Tanya Rachmanova, a significant moment. It is a victory lap, the final nail in the coffin?
Yeah, I think so. But what I like about the story, officially he came to Hong Kong for 2 days. But he didn't stay overnight in Hong Kong. He went back to mainland China to spend the night. So it's probably he thinks that Hong Kong is a part, became entirely China. But still, Hong Kong, he doesn't trust Hong Kong.
Does China still need Hong Kong to be this sort of gateway to the rest of the world?
No, I don't think so at all. He just doesn't trust, because even though there are no demonstrations anymore and so many people flew away and everything looks quiet, he still mistrusts the Hong Kong people. But no, it's all together. And he needs it, because he needs, he's very much a child of, the success of Mao Zedong. He did it. He staged it like this red book. He did white book, and then in December there was this conference, the internal conference, but published his speech where he referred only to Mao Zedong and to Stalin, never to Deng Xiaoping, which is unusual, but that's him. And he needs campaigns, so he took Hong Kong. I'm For example, I think that Taiwan is it's a serious threat. And as he saw that the West wouldn't interfere, as the West didn't in Ukraine.
Didn't interfere or
didn't send troops.
When it comes to Taiwan, is it still the same equation as it was before Russia invaded Ukraine?
That's a good question, and I'm going to pass that to Pierre.
My feeling is that China and Xi Jinping have been watching the Ukraine situation very closely on two counts. One is how the West has responded militarily, and the second one is the impact of sanctions, because that's a big worry and for China. And I think that's why you had this supposedly misstep by Joe Biden in Tokyo last month, when he said he was asked whether the U.S. would intervene to support Taiwan if in case of an invasion, and he said yes, which is very unusual, because normally the U.S. don't want to say what they will do.
They leave it vague on purpose.
Strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity.
That's the official word for it. And Joe Biden said yes. And I think what he wants to show is that he wants to tell China, don't think I'm going to have the same attitude. Because a lot of people have been criticizing Joe Biden for saying very early, as early as December, that there would be no troops sent to Ukraine because he doesn't want to start the Third World War. So later, you might have interpreted that as we won't support Taiwan either.
Shannon Forever, let me ask you, because on September 11th, 2001, the U.S. intelligence system seemed to be geared towards Russia, and suddenly realized they have to start learning Arabic and Pashto and paying attention to this part of the world. Is it pivoted all back to Russia since February, or are they also keeping an eye on China?
I think it's a really smart question to ask, especially as fears rise that maybe we could be dealing with a war or various conflicts on quote-unquote 2 fronts or 3 fronts, depending on, which autocrat decides to take a move next. In speaking with many former intelligence officials, it appears obvious that right now is a really good time to focus on Russia, in particular because many Russians who are maybe starting to feel hesitant about their support for President Putin or for the Kremlin may be questioning that and may be more willing to share some of their information, work as assets for the intelligence community. But that said, my best guess, right, is that the U.S. intelligence community is focused very much on China. We've heard multiple reaffirmations of that from President Biden, from the White House, from the State Department, and so I wouldn't doubt that the focus is there. But questions have been raised about whether the U.S. can continue to provide aid to Ukraine at the level it has been for however long the war goes on. And right now, no end appears in sight. We heard Secretary of State Tony Blinken say that President Putin has not expressed willingness to reopen negotiations for potential peace. And until that comes, if our aid maintains at certain levels, there are concerns about whether we will be fulfilling those U.S. war plans on readiness to handle other conflicts. So we may see some conversations about burden sharing coming up in the next several weeks.
All right, the U.S. Wondering if it's got the backbone on when it comes to policing the world. It's also got problems with its democracy at home. It was the week where the U.S. congressional panel investigating the January 6th storming of the Capitol in 2021 by pro-Donald Trump rioters heard surprise testimony from an advisor to the then president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows. Cassie Hutchinson recalls what Trump's Secret Service detail told her.
Tony described him as being irate. The president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now." To which Bobby responded, "Sir, we have to go back to the West Wing." The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol."
Rachel Donato, seen from this side of the Atlantic, people are wondering, I mean, is this an attempted coup? And also, why is this happening so late? Why isn't this testimony come forth sooner?
Well, I mean, this is when the Senate hearings have opened, and I mean, I think that the political terrain is shifting, but also, I mean, this is the venue in which you make this testimony under oath, and I mean, it's just extraordinary. I found Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony extraordinary, and I kind of was watching it, I think, like many people around the world, thinking like, what has happened to America? What is going on here? And what will happen? What will the consequences of this be? Or are we just watching this kind of grotesque reality show unfold, and who can stop this? What will the consequences be politically and also judicially? I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of speechless at this point.
Kind of speechless, and yet, Shannon Vavra, every Tuesday there are primaries right now for those fall midterms, and pro-Trump candidates win.
Yes, and I think the key to this is that we learned a lot about President Trump's movements and thoughts the day of, insofar as Hutchinson's testimony stands. We learned that we have a president who had a president who was basically unhinged. If you recall, some of her testimony touched on a scene in the White House where the president upended his lunch somehow, maybe pulling the tablecloth or throwing dishes, getting ketchup on the wall, when he learned that there wasn't sufficient evidence to try to overturn the election results. As a reporter, that's a really interesting scene, and I would have loved to have eyes in the room, right? But as an American, it's a really stunning thing to hear a president so violently reacting to the news that he can't continue to be president based on democracy.
Yeah, Donald Trump, by the way, may be out of office, but he has left his mark. The Supreme Court adjourning for the summer, but not before taking a wrecking ball to gun rights, to abortion rights, and now to environmental rights. That was the last ruling that came down on Friday, Pierre Haski. Again, the future's unwritten. And what happens in November? What happens in November of 2024?
Imagine, to go back to our two previous topics, imagine you're in the Kremlin or in Beijing and you're watching the US, what's happening inside the US, and you're wondering, is that the country that is going to face two major crises at the same time, that is going to defend democracy around the world? This is I don't think the Americans are thinking about that, but the significance of the image they are projecting abroad is immensely damageable, and I think it's hard to imagine the consequences, because the Russians and the Chinese leaders are already convinced that the West is in decline, that it's doomed, and that their time has arrived to shape the world again. And I think what we see in the US and what we might see in November in the midterm elections will reinforce them in this certainty, and that will have very important consequences on these two fronts.
I think that's true. Yeah, and I also think that, I mean, there's the Trump, his behavior, his temper, and then there are the midterms and the Democrats, and how are the Democrats doing, and the Democrats' problems. I mean, they're going to get hammered, and it regardless in some ways of what Trump said according to this testimony. I mean, because I also just think a lot of Americans, I mean, there's inflation, there's the economy, there's a sense that the Democrats are kind of in this, I don't know, I mean, fratricidal and slightly tone deaf, whereas the Republicans under Trump have gone off the deep end. So it's a very, very polarized and divided moment.
Yeah, Tanya Rakhmonov, picking up on Rachel's point, we saw that the Madrid NATO summit press conference, historic summit, we mentioned it, yeah. And they're asking the U.S. president about the price of at the pump of gasoline.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, Pierre and Rachel. I spent 2 years, we made this series on Trump takes on the world. So meeting all these people around Trump and listening endlessly to his speeches, it's true that seen from abroad, it doesn't look like incarnation of democracy. Or if you think, now I say like when I recently spent a lot of time with Chinese, if you think that this is an incarnation of democracy, do we want it? So it plays in favor, unfortunately, of the autocracy, and also the people in these countries who are saying that democracy is, obsolete, term, and that it doesn't work.
Democracy was tested from a different quarter in this city back in 2015 on November the 13th with a rampage, a organized group of men who killed 132 people on the night. 7 years on, after nearly 10 months of testimony, verdicts in the longest trial in French history, sentences mostly on the heavy side in the Paris attacks trial, life without parole for the sole survivor of the commando who rampaged at the Stade de France, on cafe terraces in the east of the capital, and at the Bataclan concert hall. Salah Abdeslam, one of 20 defendants, each one cross-examined carefully throughout these 10 months.
The answer to barbarism, to terrorism, is justice with a fair trial and democracy. If we hadn't responded like that, if we had responded like the Americans with a French Guantanamo, I think we would have lost everything. Now, with a trial like this, which leads us to sentences that seem to be commensurate with what was done, I imagine that we've grown from it, and we managed to have a trial in less than 7 years, which is not bad.
It was an interesting moment, Rachel Donato, during this trial, which was the former French president who was in office at the time, François Hollande, took the stand. I've spoken with several of the survivors and victims' families. They really did not appreciate his words on the night, which were that France is at war. They preferred the fact that in the end, what you got was a criminal trial.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is really a distinction that we've seen since. I mean, we've seen this in many different places. In 9/11, there was an attack on U.S. soil, which the U.S. declared was a war. And I think that that echoes in the minds of people in France after the November 13th attacks, and the fact that it was a trial and people are innocent until, until found guilty, that this is a sign of what a democracy should do. Of course, it was extremely, extremely political, but I think one of the most important takeaways from this trial was just when you are a victim and you're the family of someone who died, or you're a relative or a close person, to be acknowledged and to have an opportunity to make yourself visible after years of suffering, that is a hugely important thing for a society to do, regardless of all of the politics and whether it's an act of war or an act of terrorism. I just think that is one of the most moving and important takeaways from this whole trial.
They spent 8 million euros building this special court room within the courthouse at the Palais de Justice, the central courts here in the French capital, Pierre Aski. When you hear Rachel describe it as the un-Guantanamo, this trial, was it worth it, those 8 million euros?
Oh, definitely. I think the reaction of the survivor that we just heard was probably saying the words that everybody has in mind. We're so relieved to have had a normal trial and to have the course of justice being taken in a normal way. I think, it's very strange because only a month ago we had a lot of question marks about French democracy because people didn't go to vote. We had a record abstention figures. And here we have democracy in action on another level, which is the way to overcome a traumatic event like what happened on that night of November 13 in 2015. And I think we have a very good answer that I think most French are very proud of, that it was possible to have the rule of law was respected, the rule of defense was respected. I met the lawyer of the main accused terrorist. She came to our radio station the other day. And it was very interesting to hear, because she believes in the right of defense, which is. And
I spoke to victims on the day of the verdict,
they also
who were convinced by what she said, saying that she should not. That Salah Abdeslam should not have gotten life without parole. that that's a slow death sentence.
Yes.
But that was in the end what
Yes.
the judges handed down.
But this is the normal debate about about justice. Here she is, the lawyer of the main accused, and I think this is a sign of maturity and very. I'm personally very happy that this took place.
Tanya Rachmanova?
No, totally, absolutely agree. Because I think that this is a real incarnation of democracy. Because, you know, the number of people who come to vote, if you take the dictatorial countries where we have elections, well, you know, they come, 90% of them come to vote. Does it mean that the country is democratic? And when you can stay for so long quietly discussing and take it out of the political sphere, it was a real criminal court and everybody has had time to think about it, to listen to it. I think it was a great thing to do.
The Paris attacks, Shannon Vavra, again, the world has gotten to be a smaller place. They took place here. But of course, there were victims and survivors from all over, beginning with the Eagles of Death Metal, the group that was on stage at the Bataclan Concert Hall, who hail from the United States. How closely was this followed where you are?
I have to admit, in terms of at least coverage opportunities, it hasn't been assigned to me. It hasn't been a proposal on my end. But it does bring up a lot of reminders about violence in America and the kinds of justice that Americans would like to see when it comes to gun violence, specific victims seeing their children lost in Uvalde in Texas. So it definitely rings true, and all of the emotions come flooding back when we read about it.
It's a trial, by the way, that started back in early September, concluded this past Wednesday at the outset of the new summer. For survivors and victims' families, like that one we heard who'd been at the Bataclan Concert Hall back in 2015, Bruno Poncet, it's also now about the rest of their lives.
It took me 6 years to get out of the Bataclan. I've just spent 10 months there. I've even been in corners where I didn't want to go. I really think that today I only want to get out of there for good. On Monday, I'm going back to work. I think it's going to take a few long weeks to get back on track, to move on and to analyze what I've just experienced. But really, there's a need to get back to normal life.
On Monday, he's going back to work, Rachel Donadio.
Good for him, and tout cœur, right? I mean, it must be incredible to have watched that. I mean, I read testimony by some victims who said they didn't want to go, they didn't want to testify, and then they found themselves going and they found themselves testifying, and it became a collective experience. I mean, those of us who were in Paris that day who are still alive and weren't physically touched by that, we were stunned. I mean, it was just a horrible, horrible moment. I don't know if this brings closure, but it certainly, as Pierre and Tatiana were pointing out, it brings a sense that this is what a mature democracy does. It tries people criminally, and then it ends the trial. There is a and if there's an appeal, you know, we'll see what happens. But it just shows that this is how things work in a healthy democracy.
The Paris attacks happened on a Friday. Fridays are the day we have the world this week, and on that particular day, we at France 24 lost our sound engineer, Mathieu Hoche, who went to attend that concert at the Bataclan Concert Hall. So, of course, our thoughts were with his family and loved ones on Wednesday when that final verdict was read out. I want to thank you, Rachel Donadio. I want to thank Pierre Aski, Tanya Rachmanova, Shannon Vavra for being with us from Washington. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.